You've come to Sleepytime Stories for me to help you get to sleep. And I am going to read to you another My Naughty Little Sister story. Before we begin, I want to give you a chance to look at the illustrations. The very first little picture is next to the title here. It's a little cute profile of my naughty little sister. And here is the second illustration of Mrs. Jones looking over the garden fence at my naughty little sister in her pram. A pram is another word for a baby carriage or a stroller. The third and last illustration shows my naughty little sister about to squeeze through the hole in the fence. Now what I want you to do is wiggle around a little bit in your bed. Get into a comfortable position. Once you've got all your little wiggles out, get very comfortable. I want you to take 3 deep breaths in and out. In and out. In and out. I want you to stretch any muscles that you want to stretch. Sometimes I like to do a little happy bed dance because it is so nice to be in bed and have a cozy place to fall asleep. I have a beautiful photo of the night sky up now, and I want you to close your eyes because I'm not going to be changing the image anymore. And it's time to relax into this story so that you can fall asleep and have sweet dreams. My Naughty Little Sister Learns to Talk by Dorothy Edwards, illustrated by Shirley Hughes. Once upon a time, when my sister and I were little children, we had a very nice next-door neighbor called Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones hadn't any children of her own, but she was very fond of my sister and me. Mrs. Jones especially liked my sister, even when she was naughty, even when she was a cross and noisy baby with a screamy red face. Mrs. Jones would be kind and smiley to her and say, "There's a ducky then," to her. And sometimes Mrs. Jones would be so kind and smiley that my bad little sister would forget to scream. She would stare at Mrs. Jones instead, and when Mrs. Jones said, poor little thing," to her, my sister would go all mousy quiet for her. My naughty little sister liked Mrs. Jones. When my sister was a very little baby girl, she couldn't talk at all at first. She just made funny, blowy, bubbly noises. But one day, without anyone telling her to, she said, "Mum, Mum," to our mother. We were surprised. We told her she was a very clever baby, and because we were pleased, She said, "Mum, Mum," again and again. She said it and said it and said it until we got very used to it indeed. Then another day when my sister was saying, "Mum, Mum," and playing with her piggy toes, she saw our father looking at her, so she said, "Dad, Dad," instead. Father was very excited, and so was Mother, because our funny baby was saying, "Mum, Mum," and "Dad, Dad," as well. I was excited too, and so was dear Mrs. Jones. And because we were so excited, my sister went on and on, saying, "Dad, Dad, Dad," and "Mum, Mum, Mum," over and over again until Father, Mother, and I weren't a bit excited anymore. Only dear Mrs. Jones went on being especially pleased about it. She was a nice lady. So one morning when Mrs. Jones looked over the fence and saw my baby sister in her pram, sucking her finger, she said, "Don't suck your finger, ducky. Say Dad, Dad, and Mum, Mum for Mrs. Jones." And what do you think? My funny sister took her finger out of her mouth and said, "Dones." She said it very loudly, "Dones," like that, and Mrs. Jones was so astonished she dropped all her basket of wet washing. "Dones, Dones, Dones," my sister said, because she couldn't quite say Jones, and Mrs. Jones was so pleased. She left all her wet washing on the path and ran in to fetch Mr. Jones to come and hear. Mr. Jones, who had been hammering nails in the kitchen, came out with a hammer in his hand and a nail in his mouth, running as fast as he could to hear my sister say, "Dones." When she said it to him too, Mr. Jones said my sister was a little knockout, which meant she was very clever indeed. After that, my sister became their very special friend. When she got bigger, she started to say other words too, but Mr. and Mrs. Jones still liked it best when she said "Dones" to them. If she was in our garden and they were in their garden, they always talked to her. Even when she could walk and get into mischief, they still liked her. One day a very funny thing happened. Mrs. Jones was in her kitchen washing a lettuce for Mr. Jones's dinner when she heard a little voice say, "Dones." And there was my naughty little sister standing on Mrs. Jones's back doorstep, and no one was with her. And my little sister was smiling in a very pleased way. The back gate was closed, and the side gate was closed, and the fence was so high she couldn't have got over it. Mrs. Jones was very pleased to see my sister and gave her a big, big kiss and a jam tart, but she was surprised as well and said, "How did you get here, ducky?" But my little sister still didn't know enough words to tell about things. She just ate her jam tart. Then she gave Mrs. Jones a big kiss with jam on, but she didn't say anything. So Mr. Jones took my sister back to our house, and Mrs. Jones and Mother wondered and wondered. The very next day, when Mrs. Jones was upstairs making her bed, she heard the little voice downstairs saying, "Dones, Dones," and there was my sister again. And the back gate was shut, and the side gate was shut, and the fence was still too high for her to climb over. Mrs. Jones ran straight downstairs and picked my sister up and took her home again. When Mr. Jones came home, Mrs. Jones told him, and Mother told Father, and they all stood in the gardens and talked, and my sister laughed, but she didn't say anything. Then I remembered something I'd found out when I was only as big as my sister was then. Right up by a big bush at the back of our garden was a place in the fence where the wood wasn't nailed anymore. And if you were little enough, you could push the wood to the side and get through. When I showed them the place, everybody laughed. My sister laughed very loud indeed, and then she went through the hole straight away to show how easy it was. After that, my sister was always going in to see Mrs. Jones, but because the hole was so small and my sister was growing bigger all the time, Mr. Jones found another place in his fence, and he made a little gate there. It was a dear little white gate with an easy up and down handle. There was a step up to it and a step down from it. Mr. Jones planted a pink rose to go over the top of it and made a path from the gate to his garden path, all for my sister. It was her very own gate. And when Mrs. Jones knocked on our wall at 11 o'clock every morning, and my sister went in to have a cup of cocoa with her, she didn't have to go through a hole in the fence. She went through her very own Coco Jones's gate. I hope that you have fallen asleep. If you are still drifting off, I want you to take a very deep breath in and out, and feel yourself sinking into your bed and feeling the weight of your body. You're drifting off into sleep, and you will have a beautiful sleep. You've done all you need to do today, and now it is just time to relax and fall asleep.